And I'm very happy today to introduce a seminar by Professor Andrés Rodríguez-Pose. It's kind of embarrassing to introduce a superstar, but in any case, I'll try. Andrés Rodríguez-Pose, everybody knows him, but is a professor of economic geography at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he was also former head of the Department of Geography and the Environment from 2006 to 2009. He has been president of the Regional Science Association International and has served in various roles as vice president, secretary of the European Regional Science Association, and so on. He's also editor of the international peer review academic journal Economic Geography and one of the editors-in-chief of the Journal of Geographical Systems. And between 1999 and 2016, he was also editor of Environment and Planning C, acting as a joint chief editor from 2006 to 2016. You name it, and Andrés has done it. He has published really a huge number of academic contributions, and he has been a consultant to a number of international institutions, just to name a few: the European Commission, the European Investment Bank, the OECD, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Development Bank of Latin America. I don't know how many languages he speaks. I counted probably 7. I don't know if, Andrés, I'm correct, or
no, less.
So, less, okay.
That, yeah.
Well, but you speak, you're really very good. Your Italian is perfect, your English is perfect, your Spanish, well, you're native, so I assume that it's perfect too. And I know you even speak Russian, so really impressive and amazing. Anyway, joking aside, it's really, really an honor for me to introduce Andrés Rodríguez-Pose, and I want to thank him not just for this seminar today, but for continuously supporting our program at the GSSI. Andrés has been in our teaching committee since the very beginning of my time here in L'Aquila since 2017, and has been a regular visitor of L'Aquila. I think he knows L'Aquila very well by now. So I really, really appreciate your support, Andrés, and now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alessandra. And yeah, first, apologies to everyone for the technical problems. And thanks for your kind words at the beginning. You can see that you're a friend, and therefore probably the words at your presentation were overly kind. It's very nice to be at the Grand Sasso Science Institute. It's very nice to be in L'Aquila, albeit virtually this time because of the global pandemic. But I hope to be there not in the near future, mainly because that would be a good sign that everything is turning back to normal, but also because L'Aquila is a city that is very dear to me, and I've been visiting it now for the last 10 years on a fairly regular basis. I want to start with an apology. This is very rushed. I keep on making this mistake. My golden rule since I finished my PhD is never commit to something that you haven't finished and tried and tested and is presented. And when Sandra approached me, I said, oh, it might be a good opportunity to actually move this forward and present a topic that I had been working for some time and had first results that were fantastic in November, but then we had the problem, because I'm doing it with Neil Lee and Cornelius Lipp, that Cornelius decided to change the data set, and the results were completely different, despite only changing 60 counties in the US. So it took about 5 months to figure out what went wrong, and now that we figured it out, we got the results. But having said that, I finished my regressions about 5 in the morning last night, and the presentation about 10 minutes before being connected. Just got time to brush my teeth before that. This is not a simple individual effort. It's joint with Neil Lee and Cornelius Lipp, both from the LSE, with the only exception that neither Neil nor Cornelius know anything about what I'm going to be presenting today. So all the blame for the moment is on me. And you would see that the title is slightly different from what was announced. It was Bowling with Trump, now it's Golfing with Trump, and I'll tell you in a second why. Let me see if the slides move. Yes, the first one has moved, because otherwise the whole system was collapsing. And I have to express my sadness. There has been a lot of events in preparing this dissertation, but on Wednesday, so 2 days ago, when I was looking at trying to write to someone to get the link to the seminar, I put on Google Bowling with Trump, which was the original title, the title that I have been working for now about a year. And suddenly something called Bowling with Trump at the Brookings Institution appeared. And I was saying, did they announce the lecture? Did the Grand Sasso Institute announce the lecture at the Brookings Institute? No. What happened is that a number of American authors, Mike Faggian and co-authors, had published on the 13th of May a paper, Bowling with Trump, with which, despite the fact that the topic is more or less related, is not exactly the same. So I was really shocked to see this and saying, oh my God, the first time I got a topic, I got a title that I think is good, that can attract attention, and suddenly it's been taken by someone else. So what do I do? So it's after a few minutes of disconcert, I remember a conversation I had in London when I was talking in February with Chiara Burlina from the Gran Sasso Institute, when I was talking about this paper, and this paper called Bowling with Trump. And she noted something, and she said, well, Trump doesn't bowl. He actually golfs. And I said at that time, but well, I want to link it to Robert Putnam's work of Bowling Alone, and Bowling with Trump is probably the best title. Having said that, given circumstances, I think that Chiara was right in retrospect, and now the paper is called Golfing with Trump. And I'm going to start, it links to this book published in 2000 by Robert Putnam from Harvard University, called Bowling Alone, which is probably one of the most influential books in social sciences over the last 2 decades. In that book, Putnam, who is not keen on making predictions, made some sort of prediction. He looked at, if I can move the slide here, that, I moved the slide too much, that in this book, he used Bowling Alone as a metaphor for the massive decline in civic engagement and political participation that had become the norm in the United States since at least the mid-1960s. This decline in civic engagement and political participation meant a decline in all forms of social capital that were actually epitomized by this idea that Americans were bowling more than ever, but instead of doing it in bowling clubs and participating in bowling leagues, they were doing it alone, because those leagues were disappearing, and they were disappearing mainly in certain parts of the US where those leagues had been for a very long time a center of, let's say, social interaction and social activity. And on top of that, there was a parallel phenomenon, which was the rise in interpersonal inequality that actually coincided with this decline in social capital. He says in his page 259 that the timing of the two trends is striking. Sometime around 1965 to 1970, America reversed course and started becoming both less just economically and less well connected socially and politically. So what this happened is that there was, in many ways, this represented one of the most serious threats to American democracy. That once you have, on the one hand, a decline in social capital, and on the other hand, a rise in interpersonal inequality, what we have is that, he says, our economy, our democracy, and even our health and happiness depend on trying to restore, on the one hand, the social capital, on the other hand, trying to reduce, which comes hand in hand with social capital inequalities. Let's see if I can move this one. Yeah. The question is, was Putnam right? And we now see that there was indeed a threat to US democratic health. But the question is whether it comes from the sources that Robert Putnam actually mentioned, whether this is just a result of, on the one hand, decline in social capital, also the growth of interpersonal inequality, at least within communities and within cities and towns in the US, or of their combination. Do they reinforce each other? But one of the things that Putnam completely ignored was the fate of American towns and rural areas, this long-term economic decline, demographic decline, which started more or less at the same time as he puts the start of the decline in both interpersonal inequalities and social capital. In fact, in some parts of America, it started before, but the big trend was from the mid-1960s onwards. And this is one of the factors that other scholars that have looked into the rise of populism in other parts of the world have been highlighting strongly. This is what is leading to what Phil McCann has called this geography of discontent that led to Brexit in the US, to the politics of resentment that Kathy Kramer identified in a very nice book, The Politics of Resentment, in the case of Wisconsin, and to what I've called the revenge of the places that don't matter, not just in the case of Europe, although most of my work has been focused in Europe. And what I can say is that what I'm going to try to argue is that, in principle, that perhaps the predictions of Putnam worked in a different way than he expected, that the result of the rise in this populism, the swing to votes to Donald Trump in the last election, was fundamentally a result of long-term economic decline, and as a consequence of that, the rise of territorial inequality rather than interpersonal inequality and decline of social capital at the local level. Let me just start with what we all know, which is that Putnam's prediction was fulfilled. We didn't have to wait for too long. He published his book in 2000. We have the results of the election in 2016, in which Donald Trump, an entrepreneur, whether he's successful or not is another matter, with relatively an outsider within even the Republican Party, and with clear tendencies towards a populist discourse, as we are now seeing, and it has become evident to all, won the election, something that no one would have predicted just 1 year before when Obama was riding, despite some problems, waves of popularity. And you can have here the two maps. First is the vote for Donald Trump, concentrated in, if you take a look, this is not population standardized, but you can take the whole of the center of the United States in red, that's votes for Donald Trump. In blue, concentrated mainly on both coasts and along the most populated cities of the US, vote for Hillary Clinton. But the most important map for the purposes of this analysis for me is the swing to Donald Trump, the swing in Republican vote from votes that happened to the previous Republican candidate, Mitt Romney in 2012, to Donald Trump, which is highly concentrated in certain parts of America. Mainly, if you can see here, in the areas of the so-called Rust Belt, going all the way from Minnesota through Wisconsin, Iowa, but also through Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania. And we have to remember that it was Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin that were the states that swing and gave the presidency to Donald Trump. The question is, to what extent is this related to social capital, to interpersonal inequality, and to rises or decline in economic and demographic perspective? And the question is why? Why did this swing happen? There are three possible explanations. If we take Robert Putnam, we have the main explanation is this erosion of social capital in American society. The idea that America, or the United States, for a long, long time, was a society that was very much based on interaction, on strong social bonds at the local level that formed strong communities that were the base of American prosperity. And this came to an end, as Putnam says, without at first noticing, in the mid-1960s, in which Americans, the communities that forged the prosperity of America, have been pulled apart over the last third of the 20th century. And that trend, according to recent data, seems to have continued. And this is something he regrets, because he says that social capital is one of the foundations that reinforces and contributes to the progress of American society, and made American society, US society, one of the richest and most dynamic and more open and more stable democracies in the world. And for him, this represents a big risk, because the performance of democratic institutions depends to a large extent, as he says, on social capital. And in order to avoid or to prevent this threat to American democracy, there's a need to reinforce, to go back and try to reinitiate this trend of social capital that had been dominant throughout most of the history of the United States, and that had been discontinued over the last 50 years. The second one is also coming from Putnam, although there's a lot of other work in this field, which is the polarization in terms of wealth in American society, the concentration of wealth in fewer hands, in fewer people, in an increasing gap between the rich and the poor. That was very high before the First World War, but then we had a period for the best of 2/3 of a century in which inequality had declined in the US, but it has become, as we have seen, especially in the last 40 years, now a pervasive feature of the United States, which is one of the most unequal countries in terms of income among those countries in the developed world. And this is something that has been confirmed, and there's plenty of work on this, the work of Rafchetti, for example, but also Piketty and Sayers at a higher level in other parts of the world. Branko Milanovic and Danny Dorling for the UK have done also significant work confirming this type of trends. So the concentration of more and more wealth in the top quintile, in the top 5%, in the top 1%, and what Danny Dorling calls the 0.1%. That is the real group that's accumulating more wealth at the expense of those at the bottom of the pyramid. And this is leading to a lot of work in recent years linking inequality as fundamentally the main driver of populism. There are two main explanations of the rise of populism. There are the economic explanations, then there are the cultural explanation. Among the economic explanations, most of the work is linking the rise of populism to the rise of interpersonal inequality. So what we're seeing is that with greater people left behind, with a greater amount of people everywhere, especially in the US, at risk of falling into poverty, there's a tendency for individuals to reject the status quo, and this is leading to an erosion of democratic institutions, creating nativism, plutocracy, and phenomena like Brexit or the election of Donald Trump. And Robert Putnam says that these two factors go hand in hand and they reinforce one another. So he states in the book that the American states with the highest levels of social capital are precisely those states that are the most characterized by economic and civic equality, and vice versa. Those states where there's a weaker social capital that have witnessed the biggest decline in social capital are also the ones that have seen the greatest rise in inequality. So in order to address the problem of the risks to democracy in the US, the solution for Putnam is relatively simple. Try to rebuild social capital, and through rebuilding social capital, you also help dealing with inequality, and by dealing with inequality, you also reduce the risk of ending up with populist politicians in office at the local, at the state, or, as we see now in the case, at the level of the whole country. Okay, let's see, I'm trying to get my watch in position. Okay, but there's one factor that is conspicuously absent in Putnam's work. Robert Putnam's work, Bowling Alone, is all about all sorts of decline. He takes a look at decline in social capital, civil engagement, political participation, voter turnout, in newspaper circulation, personal letter writing, union membership, church attendance, club meetings, social visiting, charitable giving, volunteering, social trust, you name it, everything he has checked. He forgot one important thing, in at least for a geographer's perspective, which is that of Midtown and rural America. Very often when he mentions towns, when he mentions rural areas, is to say that the process of social capital decline is the same whether you are in a small city or you are in a town or you are in one of the largest cities in the US. However, it's becoming increasingly clear by the work done in other parts of the world. Again, Ian is here, he's doing that in the case of the US. Phil McCann, in the case of the UK, Phil McCann also for the case of Brexit, Louis Dijkstra, Hugo Pullman and myself in the case of Europe, but more recent work like by Kathy Kramer and Jonathan Rodden in a very interesting book looking at the rural-urban divide in the US and its implications for votes, having highlighted the idea that geography matters, that places matter, and that in particular, it might be economic decline, demographic decline, and long-term decline that are at the root of this emergence of discontent that is transformed into, on the one hand, the rise of populism, or no ties of populism at the ballot box, but also in discontent that in the case of France, for example, the Gilets jaunes has gone beyond that and has created also some level of revolt. So what I'm going to try to argue here is that whereas Robert Putnam was right in making a prediction that US democracy was at risk, and despite the fact that we're talking about a very strong democracy with strong institutions, with a separation of powers that counterbalance one another, the situation is much worse than what it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. But he was wrong on the potential factors behind it. That the rise of populism, the swing of votes to Donald Trump, has not been associated to a decline in social capital, has not been connected to a rise in interpersonal equality, at least at the local level, or their combination. That if anything, these factors go in the opposite direction than what Putnam was saying. He was saying that, well, if you decline, there's a decline in social capital, you will end up with greater threats to democracy. What I'm going to say is that it's precisely the places where you have stronger, either social capital might be irrelevant, but if not, is the stronger places with stronger social capital, the ones that have decided that they want to switch to populism. That interpersonal equality, in fact, is not at the local level, not related to swing to populism, that in fact it might actually, more inequality might be associated to lower populist tendencies at the moment, and the combination doesn't work. What I'm going to try to argue is that in the US, like we've seen elsewhere in the case of Europe, it is long-term decline, long-term economic decline in employment, in earnings, in income, in wages, or demographic decline in population, places that have been losing people, have been shedding population for quite so long, that are the main factors at the root of this threat to US democracy. And that in many cases, a strong social capital and cohesiveness may have contributed to generate this revenge of the places that don't matter, or to put a lot of places that have been neglected for a long time, that have been disregarded by policymakers in France, in the US, or in the UK and in other parts of the world, especially in the developed world, on the map through their reactionary ballot box. The mechanisms, I'm not going to get into that, but I would recommend that you all read Kathy Kramer's book, The Politics of Resentment, about Wisconsin, which will be a combination of this increasing awareness of social identities and social consciousness that takes place in areas, rural areas, small town America, that still have a much stronger social capital than in the big cities. And whereas in places with high inequality but weak social capital, mainly the large cities, this is something that hasn't happened yet. Okay, so let me just start with the model. I'm trying to now highlight what the analysis is here behind. So what I'm going to try to explain is the change in the Republican vote, so mainly the swing to Donald Trump from votes at county level for Mitt Romney in 2012. Mitt Romney as a mainstream traditional candidate with a long political history within the Republican Party, to the election in November 2016 of Donald Trump, an outsider with clear populist tendencies and appealing to a large extent a populist discourse. And this swing in the vote would be a factor of three elements that we're trying to analyze. The first one is social capital and Putnam's decline in social capital. The idea that, according to him, a decline in social capital would lead to swings to, let's say, options that are a threat to democracy, rise in interpersonal inequality at county level, and also economic and demographic change measured in four ways, which are change in employment, change in wages, change in earnings, and change in population. And this is done over the long term. So we have data starting in 1970. So we do it for 46 years between 1970 and 2016, but we also do it decade by decade, 1980, 2016, 1990, 2000, and 2010, 2016, to see whether this has got also a temporal dimension. We control for the level of wealth of the county measured by the median income, and we include a series of controls at county level, which include population density, levels of unemployment, education, race measured by the share of black population. We also have the white non-Hispanic population later on as a control, a level of voter turnout, because these are all factors that, according to the literature, are associated with discontent at the ballot box, expecting that mainly a greater unemployment would lead to more, let's say, votes for populist parties, where more education, greater voter turnout, and a greater share of minorities, which are the targets very often of this populist discourse, would lead to a lower swing to populist options, a lower vote for Trump. We include state fixed effects, and we have an error term, and this is all down at county level. So we have data for all counties in the US over a period that spans 70 years, although it's an OLS analysis, mainly because we have one data point in our dependent variable, which is, in this case, the swing of votes between two elections. I mean, we have done the analysis also just with the share of vote for Trump, and the results are remarkably similar. But we find that it's much more interesting to look at the swing, because that's where we add the premium of populism. Votes for the Republican Party very often have remained relatively stable for quite some time. Okay, let me just go to the results of the quickly put together analysis. And here's the basic model. Here what we use is inequality measured by the Gini coefficient. So inequality within the county. So whether counties are very unequal or they are more equal. We look at one of the economic variables, employment change, but then we're going to look at all the others later on. And we take as our base a period of, it's not 80-20, it's 80-16, so 36 years between, which is a very long-term type of transformation. And we look at the level of social capital as measured by the Wharton School Index in 2016. And we control by the level of density in 2016, unemployment rate in 2016, the average of education, so measured by the percentage of adult population with a bachelor's degree or higher in between 2013 and 2017, and the share of a Black population in a county in 2017, plus the voter turnout at the elections in presidential elections in 2016. What do we get? I always like to start with the control variables, and the control variables very much go with expectations. Vote for Trump happens to a larger extent in poorer countries, in poorer counties than in richer counties, which is something that was expected. In places with low density, there's, well, that's the only one that is less of a vote, but it's not very strong. Unemployment is insignificant. And then the three strong factors with income is that places with more highly educated, with higher level of minorities, in this case proxied by the Black population, and with a higher voter turnout, the swing to Trump was significantly lower. Where the real interest and the action takes place is on our three variables of interest. First, let's take a look at inequality. Here, the prediction by Putnam was that greater levels of inequality would lead to a bigger threat to democracy. What we find is that the places with the biggest levels of interpersonal inequality, which are normally the cities, are the ones that have a tendency to vote less for Donald Trump. And with the higher densities in the same direction, the places with a higher density have a lower swing for Donald Trump. With social capital, it depends on whether we introduce controls or not, but we find that the results is insignificant. It doesn't make that much of a difference. And if anything, it tends to be associated with a rise in the swing towards Donald Trump. What is interesting is that places that have seen a biggest increase in employment over the last 36 years are the ones that vote the least for Donald Trump. So that means that places that have seen their employment levels contract, both in absolute but also in relative terms, are the ones that actually have had a tendency to provoke the swing towards Donald Trump. So what we have is already the first result. The first interesting result is that the two factors that Robert Putnam was highlighting as the key threats to democracy are actually working in the opposite direction individually, especially inequality, than what Putnam was highlighting. And the one that was forgotten, which is long-term economic decline, leading to greater territorial inequalities in terms of employment opportunities, is the one that seems to be driving seems to be driving this swing to Donald Trump. But what about the interactions? Because also Robert Putnam said inequality and social capital, they work in the same direction. So here we do the analysis with the three interactions of the three factors, the three variables of interest. And what we find is that strong social capital and high inequality actually lead to increases in swings to Trump. So, which is not exactly what Putnam was predicting, saying, yeah, if you have high inequality, but you have a stronger social capital, then you might get more votes for Trump than in places where you have weaker social capital, which tend to be the largest in larger cities, and we're controlling for density. All the other factors, for example, the interaction between employment and social capital, what we find is that in places with long-term rises in employment, social capital seems to be a higher social capital to reduce the swing to Trump. Whereas the interaction between inequality and employment doesn't change that much. Most of the other variables, including the controls that are not reported here but introduced, they don't change when we introduce the interactions. And these results are very strongly robust to changes in measurements. We have played with the results quite a lot, both in November and now. And what we get is that they are extremely robust. Here's just another analysis, changing race. We've gone from Black to white non-Hispanic. All the other coefficients remain more or less the same. What we find is that now it's all significant and positive in terms of white non-Hispanic. The only thing that changes with respect to the Black population is the sign of the coefficient that goes from negative to positive. What about if we change the measures of inequality? Because it might not be about inequality within local community, but it might be about the concentration of wealth in specific groups of the population. So we take the income, the share of people in the community, in the county, that are in the top quintile of income in the US. So the bigger the share, the lower the swing towards Trump, which is in the same direction as inequality. If we do the same with other measures, this is not the top quintile, this is the top 5%, what we get is that the results are more or less the same. In fact, high concentrations of rich people in counties are associated to more pro-establishment votes, lower swings to Donald Trump. That tend to happen in those areas where you have more pervasive poverty. I haven't reported that, but we introduce poverty, and poverty is once you control for race and you control for other factors associated to votes for Trump. Okay, what about different types of decline? Is this only about employment over a certain period, or is it repeated for a lot of other factors? And what we get here is that once we introduce different types of measures of economic and demographic decline, what we find is that the results remain the same. So in most cases, what you see is, for example, in the cases of the Gini coefficient, it is always negative and highly significant. Median income is negative and highly significant. The controls that are not reported don't change. Social capital is either insignificant or higher social capital is connected to a swing to votes in Donald Trump. And what we get is that across the board, we have negative coefficients linking increases in employment, increases in demographic increases, rises in a relative rise in earnings and wages to a decline in swing for Donald Trump. That means that the places that have lost more employment in absolute or in relative term, that have lost population, that have seen their wages decline more, are the ones that, and this is over a period of 36 years, the ones that have tilted the balance in favor of populism and present this risk to democracy. Earnings change over this period is negative and significant. What about if we change the time frame, the change, and look at the change over time? What we find is that there are two factors that seem to be driving the change, and that's employment change and population change. The places that have lost the most, and here we're not reporting anything else, just the coefficients, over periods of, let's say, 6 years, which coincides with the financial crisis, and the recovery period, 16 years, 26 years, 36 years, and 46 years. In terms of employment and population, the places that have seen the biggest employment decline and population change, population decline, are the ones that have decided with their ballots to elect Donald Trump as president, or have made that swing. In terms of earnings and wages and changes in wages, the results are a bit more mixed, although, as you can see, in terms of earnings, all the coefficients are negative and significant in 3 out of the 5. In the changes in wages, this is the only surprising result, in which over the crisis period, places that have seen their wages increase the most also have had a greater swing. Once you control for all other things to Donald Trump, all the others are either insignificant or, well, is also 1970, and the one from 1980 is negative and significant. So what we can see is that this is mainly driven by employment change, population change, to a less extent earnings change, that the effects are very, very long lasting. And when you look at employment change and population change, the effects tend to wane a bit over time, but they are resilient. There's a lot of resilience in this period. Okay, so let me just try to wrap up on these results. So how can we take stock of all this? The first one is that in contrast to what Putnam was predicting, it's fundamentally long-term economic decline, employment decline more than anything, and demographic decline linked to the decline of Midtown America, rural America, the tightly knit American community that was where this social capital was stronger and remains stronger and most represented, that is the one driving populism. This decline in populism, this decline in economic decline over the long term accumulated has created this malaise that goes well beyond the crisis, and that is increasingly manifesting itself at the ballot box, in which we have seen that these people are voting for a candidate, an outsider like Donald Trump, but they're probably going to go on trying to vote for candidates that pay more attention to them, that focus or try to redress to a certain extent their neglect, although they might not do anything afterwards, rather than to mainstream candidates that are regarded to be a self-serving elite. What we're finding is that declining but relatively rather cohesive communities with a strong social capital seem to be the main drivers of this place. Is small rural town America in the Rust Belt, in the Midwest, places that were the centers of America's manufacturing, that were prosperous, where you had in the post-war period, jobs for all. You had the male breadwinner model that facilitated at that time with a strong manufacturing base, like large prosperity, that have seen manufacturing disappear, that have seen their people with the biggest skills move out and have lost population, the ones that are driving this process. This is nothing to do with the rise of interpersonal inequalities within this community. They tend to be relatively cohesive communities, but cohesive communities that have lost out over time. And this is communities that have seen better times, that have been dismissed as flyover states, Rust Belt, redneck areas, and they are exacting their revenge at the ballot box. These are people that they're no longer bowling alone. They are actually still cohesive, and they got a champion. So they're not bowling alone as Putnam did. They are golfing with Trump, and you can see. And the problem is that Trump is probably not the factor. Trump is just, who happened to be there, and he was at the right time at the right place. These are communities that were probably, given the situation, given the long-term neglect, given the resentment that was measured through a large number of interviews by Kathy Kramer, they will continue to play golf or basketball or American football or whatever you name it, with whoever is perceived to pay attention to them, and with whoever is deemed to, at least, on paper, at least in electoral campaigns, to try to reverse the neglect and deal with this disdain that these communities have felt coming from, rightly or wrongly, from, let's supposedly, American elite for now more than half a century. I'm going to leave it there, and I'll be very happy to try to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Andrés. Can I suggest just a very quick 5 minutes break, if anybody wants to grab coffee or whatever. And Andrés, if you stop sharing your slides in the meantime, and you also seem to have covered your camera, so you are, the camera is on, but we can only see something black. Also,
no, I haven't touched the camera, so.
Ah, okay. Because it seems like it's covered or something. Maybe
no
flap on your thing, no?
No. It's standalone. So I'm glad it just came at the very last moment. So
okay. So for the people that are attending, before we actually take the 5-minute break, if you want to ask Andrés a question, can you please write on the chat that you would like to ask a question? So I have an order of people, and then when we come back in 5 minutes, I will go through the list and ask you to actually ask your question. So 5 minutes, we'll be back in 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Andres, now we can see you.
Yeah, I don't know what happened there, but it switched itself. So.
That's fine. just 3-4 minutes and then we'll be back. I don't know if you want to just grab a cup of coffee or something. Okay, Andres is back, and
Can you see me?
Yes, we can see you, we can hear you, everything good. And so the first one is actually, hi Vasilis. Vasilis Monastiriotis has a question for you.
Well, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so hi Alessandra and everybody. Andres, thanks, that was a great presentation and very interesting sort of narrative and findings. I want to ask you about the inequality side of it rather than the social capital side of it. You didn't kind of went further to the explanation why would inequality both within counties, so the Gini measure, and in terms of income relative to other places in the US, why it creates more Democrat vote in a way. And I can think of two reasons. One could be just that where you have a lot of inequality, people have preferences for redistribution, so they vote for a party that may be more redistributive, the Democrats. The other one could be something that relates to the kind of cultural explanations of the rise of populism. So maybe, as it happens at least in the US, places with more inequality are also places that are more cosmopolitan. So I can think of, the average county in the Rust Belt would have less inequality, but also less cosmopolitanism, whereas New York City with a lot of cosmopolitanism, but also a lot of inequality. So are you trying to make, or are you making any, or would you like to sort of suggest something? Why is inequality playing this role? Is it sort of electoral politics in relation to the distribution? Is it a link to cosmopolitanism, or is it something else? Yeah.
Do I collect or do I reply?
As you like. Do you want me to collect few and then answer?
Whatever you prefer. I don't know what the norm is. So.
Oh, then you can answer, and then we'll go to the next one.
Thank you very much, Vasilis. On the terms of inequality, when you take a look at the economic explanations about the rise of populism, most of the work by economists tends to highlight that rising inequalities are connected, or they seem to be connected, to greater votes for populism in the developed world. The explanations have varied. One is the China shock, for example, the idea that Chinese competition coming from outer and others, the Chinese competition has hit those at the bottom of the pyramid, those that were doing, had the low, medium income, low, medium skilled jobs that have been lost in terms of manufacturing, and they are the ones reacting. Also that the rise of inequality is leading to pushing a lot of people to poverty or near poverty or above, right above poverty. And these are people that are feeling resentment against the system. So most of the literature goes in that direction. We don't find that, mainly because what we find is that we're looking at inequality at the local level, not at the national level, but that would be enveloped with territorial inequality. But the two arguments that you highlight might be significantly plausible. In the case of the US, you have this idea of the preference for redistribution and the vote for the Democrats, but very much that would be also connected to the race sort of dimension in US politics, in which the poorest of the poor tend to be also ethnic minorities and tend to also vote in general Democrats, and have done so for quite some time. So it might be difficult to entangle. So whether this is a preference for distribution or this is other factors that are associated to that, which is extreme poverty and ethnic minorities. In the case of Europe, we have less of to a lesser extent that problem, although that's seems to be growing. And here, what we find is that there's those groups have tended to switch to, normally in cities, to left-wing populism, whereas in small towns and rural areas, they have tended to switch to right-wing populism. The cultural explanation is more cosmopolitan, etc. That might be part of the explanation, but I'm not sure. First, I'm not an expert on that, and second, I'm not sure what would be the difference in terms of cosmopolitanism of, let's say, a very low-income person living in the ghettos of northern Philadelphia and a medium to low-income person living in a small city in Indiana, Iowa, or Wisconsin.
Okay. So next, Sandro Montesor had some questions.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, thanks, Andrés, for having accepted the invitation to come to the webinar, first of all. And second, for this very nice and interesting presentation. I like it very, very much, the great effectiveness with which you have been able to translate the idea of the paper into the econometric application. And my question mainly refer to the econometric part of the presentation. The first question that I have, incipit. I'm not really that expert of American communities. I definitely know more about the Italian European ones, but I'm wondering, couldn't be the case that there is certain propensity in American communities in the swinging of votes? That is, couldn't be that some communities are more propense to swing in votes and others instead are more persistent? Isn't there, couldn't be sort of part dependency in this variable that eventually could be controlled for? I mean, in the Italian case, we have some regions which are more propense in swinging their votes, some others instead, which are definitely more stable. I'm wondering whether that could be present also in the American scenario. The second question that I have, forgive me if it is a trivial one, because I'm sure you have already thought about that, about the notable distinction in social capital between bridging and bonding social capital. I'm wondering whether, first of all, the distinction could be relevant for your theoretical argument, and secondly, whether it would be possible to actually insert this distinction in the econometric analysis. And third question that I have, Again, forgive me if I miss it. Is there any way to control for the strength of the electoral campaigns of the different parties that are involved in the swings? So it might be that the swing has been driven by the strength with which a certain party has made the electoral campaigns in the community. I think that could be an interesting control to retain if it's possible. And that's it. I mean, I just have these 3 questions by now.
Okay, thank you very much, Sandra, and thanks for the invitation to the seminar. It's always a pleasure to be there. On the case of swinging votes and tendency to swing votes, this is something that it's a very interesting topic, and there are in the US swinging states, like there would be swinging counties. Ohio is, Alessandra knows it best, as the typical one, as bellwether state, and the one that always chooses the president and decides, together with Florida as the 2 cases. Pennsylvania is another one, Virginia. So many in Michigan, many of the ones that have swung are traditional swinging states. Wisconsin is a bit less, for example, but nevertheless, it's a state with a tendency. So it might be just a normal swing, although it was an extreme candidate, and the swing was bigger in certain areas, especially in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa, than was expected. Having said that, we haven't done that yet, but we did in November with the previous data set. We did the swing from Romney to Trump, but we also did the swing from the 5 previous elections, so Republican vote to Trump in 2016, and we got very similar results, almost the same. Having said that, one of the things that probably has gone unnoticed is that we think that this is a new phenomenon, but there are states that have not swung, but have had for a long time populist tendencies. And I would say that many of the local vote in counties and in southern states that swung from Democrats to Republicans already in the 1960s and 1970s, and have remained strong Republican states since then, probably was already linked to populism. The Democratic Party in the South up to the 1960s was very, very different from the Democratic Party in the rest of the county. And I would say that the Republican Party is very different from the rest. What we're probably seeing at this moment is the same process that we saw 40, 50 years ago in the south of the US happening in the Rust Belt. And that's why it might be interesting to see. Second, bridging and bonding social capital. This is something that is very interesting. I like the topic a lot. I think that's one of the big contributions that social capital can play in both directions, with bonding social capital being normally negative for any sort of outcomes, economic growth or employment or any sort of political outcomes like the ones we're looking at here. And bridging social capital as being positive by creating stronger networks within communities, etc. This is something that would be certainly very interesting to do, and there's something that Vogelzeig, among others, has done for Europe. But I've been doing also at regional level in Europe with Jonathan Wingani and Rune Fitcher in Stavanger, working on data coming from the European Social Survey. To be honest, it would be very difficult for me or for our team to try to make that distinction in the case of the US, because we'll have to go to the original source of data. So I leave it. I mean, it's massively interesting, but I leave it for someone else to do at the moment. I think highlighting that social capital might go in the opposite direction is more than enough than expected. And then the strength in the electoral campaign at a local level. It is something also massively interesting. We'll have to look at how much was campaigned in every country in the US. And I think that pushes much more into the political science realm than we actually want to go. But having said that, I think this is something that is very, very interesting and worth actually analyzing.
Thank you very much, Andrés. Now we have Masoud Ghiazi, who has a question.
Hi, Andreas. Thank you very much for your presentation. I feel I like it, so it's very interesting. I have a couple of questions. First of all, because you showed the map of the voting it seems that there is a subtle autocorrelation effect. There's a chain effect that one county, favored Donald Trump, and then it moved on. And,
Sorry, Masood, I cannot hear you very well. So.
do you hear me now?
Yes, now much better.
Speak a little bit louder.
Yeah.
So, first of all, the map that you showed us, it showed that there was a sort of spatial autocorrelation effect. One counties were in favor of Donald Trump, and then the other counties probably followed the same path in voting for Donald Trump. This is one point, and the other point is regarding the weight, the changes for wages. So, is it a positive changes or is it negative changes? And because when you showed the long-term changes from I think it was 1970 to 2016, it was positive, but for the short term, it was 2000, 2006, it was negative. So it means that it showed me that somehow that if the counties are experiencing negative, probably they were more in favor of voting for Donald Trump, while the structural changes, which long-term, it was positive, it was not in favor of Donald Trump. And also regarding the different ethical groups, just a suggestion, I don't know, you're an expert more than me on that side. Would it be helpful to use the share of different nationalities in each county rather than black or Hispanic, or would it be more meaningful? Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you very much, Masood, and nice to see you again. So the question on spatial autocorrelation, I haven't done it, but I think it's interesting to see whether there's this spatial dependency of connecting one to the other. We might do it for this paper, we might not do it for this paper, we might do it for another, but it's certainly worth analyzing. On the question of wages, you raised something that I was saying, should I include wages or should I not include wages? Because in the end, it's the only one that goes counter. I said, this is the first presentation, I can get feedback. What you normally would expect is that over such a long time, on electoral performance, there would be no significance, there would be no effect. And what I find remarkable is that for 3 of the 4 variables, so economic change and demographic change variables, the results are so consistent and so strong over time. That wages goes in all directions is what I expected over the longer term for most other factors. So yeah, I cannot explain why if your wages have increased since the 1970s, then you vote more for Donald Trump. But if they have increased from the 1980s, you vote less for Donald Trump, or there's a less of a swing to Donald Trump. This is something worth studying, but I wouldn't make too much of that. What I would make much more is about the consistency of all the other indicators going in the same direction, meaning that regardless of the period considered and regardless of the indicator considered, with the exception of wages, what you get is that more decline leads to more disenchantment, more discontent, and more swing to an outsider candidate. And then in terms of the ethnic groups, whether it would be better to do some nationality analysis, I'll hesitate to do a nationality analysis. I would probably go for foreign-born population in the US. Having said that, I don't know whether that would be better than using, let's say, ethnic groups, because there's a tendency where the foreign-born population is across the spectrum. Many of the migrants would be at the bottom end of the income pyramid, but there would be certainly, especially Asians going to Silicon Valley, etc., that would be high earners. What we find is that in general, what we have is, for example, the Hispanic population and the Black population, which get results that are very similar, stronger for the Black population, tend to be much more consistently, with, of course, exceptions, in the lowest income groups in the population. That was the only reason. But of course, it would be interesting, rather than looking at specific nationalities, to focus on foreign-born.
Thank you, Andres. Vlad Miknenko, he has a question. Do you want to ask Andres yourself, since I saw you connected before?
Oh, yes. Thank you. Hello, Andres. Glad to see you. Thank you for the
brief. I cannot see you. Can you turn on your camera? Hi, Vlad.
don't know whether it's working or not.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, homeschooling problems. Just a quick question on this. We've had some evidence on sort of decoupling between territorial imbalance trends between the US and the EU. We have regional sort of convergence in the EU 27 over the last 20, 30 years. And we've had regional divergence in the US over the last several decades. One of the explanatory variables for that difference, some people suggest, is cohesion policy, EU regional policy, and the distribution and investment across the continent, which is, of course, not the case in the US. If we don't presume a major shift towards some kind of regional policy in the US, do we need to then assume that there'll be more Trump?
Okay.
Question.
All right. So we can probably need to assume that there would be not necessarily Trump, because not Trump is in trouble, but there would be this phenomenon being repeated for the foreseeable future in many places in Europe and elsewhere. And I would hesitate. I mean, you start well with the idea of regional convergence in Europe and regional divergence in Europe. I do hesitate because some of the places, some of the countries in Europe that have grown the most have also fallen into the temptation of populism. I'm thinking about mainly Poland, to a lesser extent Hungary, that has had. So these are countries that have prospered, that have benefited significantly from structural funds, but that despite significant convergence and therefore pushing regional convergence in Europe within countries, what we have is significant regional divergence. And when you look at the maps, especially in the case of Poland, it's very clear. What you find is that the areas that have been left behind, many rural areas in the eastern part of the country and outside the cities, fundamentally in this case Warsaw, but also Białystok, Lublin, etc., are the ones that have elected options, in this case the PiS party, the Law and Justice Party, for government. If you take a look at the Hungarian map, is the same. It's outside Budapest and Szeged, and that's about it. Nothing more than that. So there's a key factor there that perhaps what we're seeing is convergence at the national level, not at the subnational level, and that's also creating populism because people still in Europe think of themselves as fundamentally Polish or Hungarian or Italian or Spanish, and not as European. Having said that, the cohesion policy is probably the right way. I don't know whether you attended my presentation last year before the pandemic at the Regional Studies Conference, Winter Conference, in which I had a paper precisely on that. And the paper on that was saying that the more money that is invested in cohesion policy, and I'm talking about investment, I'm not talking about handouts, is linked to a reduction in Eurosceptic and populist votes. This is where, for example, I think intervention and regional policy that is being done in Europe is much, much better than the sort of policies that are now being promoted by people like Ed Glaser or Larry Summers, which are mainly subsidies. When last year they came out, well, not last year, 2018, with their first paper on looking at the election of Donald Trump and the rise of territorial inequality, their solution was, let's put more money and subsidies into places that have no future, because it doesn't make sense to invest here. What we need is to keep these people happy, subsidies. And my first reaction when I saw it, and I think the analysis I've conducted since then reinforce it, is this is what we have done in Europe for the last 50 years, and it hasn't worked. This is what was adopted in many places of Italy after they would run out of, decided they were not going to do it. So for the south of Italy, for the north of England. And in the end, it has created dependent societies that has not quelled this threat to democracy, this rise of populism. So I think we need more territorially based, place-sensitive type of interventions. But at the moment, we're doing very, very little. Because although the European cohesion policy is the largest scheme by far in the world for territorial intervention, the biggest difference, it still represents 0.3% of GDP in the European Union, And the biggest difference can be made by national governments. And national governments have, for the best of 30 years in Europe, decided that this is not for them, that this should be done by the European Union. I suppose that the pandemic, with all its negative impact and all its suffering that it has caused, may provide an opportunity for states to rethink and say, what can we do in order to address the plight of areas that have got potential, but that potential has been neglected, have received little support. And very often that support have been seeing a lot of services, a provision of public services shed because it was not profitable in traditional models to actually provide them.
Thank you very much. Now we have a question from Ugo Rossi. You haven't met him yet. He is a new adding to our GSSI family. He's associate professor in economic geography.
Hi, Andres. Nice to meet you. Thanks for your excellent talk. Really enjoyed it. I want to ask, Bowling alone by Putnam was criticized by Richard Florida in his famous the rise of the creative class. He said that a Putnam idea of social capital had to be associated with a traditional sense of community, especially in suburban areas, while he opposed to this anthropology, this idea of urbanity and the urban values, which in the end proved to be very much associated with with prosperous coastal cities and with a very white creative class. So, and Trump was a kind of response to this dualism between the suburbs and the prosperous, the rural areas, the suburbs, and the prosperous coastal cities in a way, and the wider populist explosion. But I want to ask you, the recent eruption of protests across US cities with Black Lives Matter, I think it's something that is to be taken into account seriously, because this proves not only that in big cities, and including the prosperous coastal cities I was mentioning earlier, there is a sense of community which goes beyond the white creative class. But there is a sense of community also in brown, in black communities. But what is interesting is that I was reading some newspaper articles that these protests have happened not only in these big cities where black communities are particularly big and where there is a tradition of civil rights movement, but even in small towns and rural areas. Like there have been protests very significant even in the rural Wisconsin, which is at the center of the Scott Walker ascendancy and the book on the politics of resentment that you were mentioning. So, and many white people have been participating. This is the big novelty in these protests. Many white people have joined the blacks, the black communities in these protests, and this happened not only in liberal cities, big cities on the coast, but even in these small cities. So perhaps this is the big news in US politics, something that could really disrupt this dichotomy between the prosperous cities on the coast and the rural areas and the small towns. And perhaps the Democratic Party could really realize that issues of economic inequality and of racial justice are not opposed to each other. So this could be really a watershed moment in US politics. What do you think about it?
Okay, thank you very much, Hugo. We haven't met, but I know exactly who you are, so that's good. On the question of social capital and Florida's criticism of Robert Putnam, I completely agree with Richard Florida here. I think that Putnam's vision of social capital is a very nostalgic type of vision, going back to an America that no longer exists. So it's this idea that social capital is associated to local political participation in local town meetings, joining local bands, local clubs. And of course, when you have a declining communities, that is impossible. You have a different type of social capital that is emerging, and it's emerging in different ways. And the way you relate today in cities is very much different from the way we were relating 40 years ago. So I would probably be critical of Putnam's definition and most of the measurements. However, most of the measurements that we have of social capital at the moment are very much based on Putnam, including the one I'm using, which is from the Wharton School, but also the type of analysis that have been done in Europe based on that. There would be a way of there should be a need to try to redefine social capital in the way it is, because there's also a sense of community, albeit perhaps is not as visible as it is in these traditional senses. Now the question is this going to be a watershed moment, etc.? When I wrote The Revenge of the Places That Don't Matter, I highlighted that the main reason for this revenge was the rise in territorial inequalities, the long-term economic decline, more than anything. But I also highlighted that territorial inequalities were a fraction of interpersonal inequalities. And interpersonal inequalities fundamentally play in big cities. I said our cities are this high inequality. Our cities are not a place, but they can become a place in the future. I hope this is not going to be the case, because I don't think that conflict sometimes is good if it leads to quick transformation, but sometimes it can revive in difficult situations. But having said that, there is the possibility that pervasive poverty and because in fact inequalities are 70% are within regions, not across regions. So if this explodes, it can go really bad. The question at the moment is that when we look at long-term economic decline and territorial inequalities, these people in declining towns, in declining rural areas, in medium-sized cities that are doing badly, they now have someone who they can play golf with, and this is Trump. In the US at the moment, the people, the urban poor, the ethnic minorities that have been marginalized and disadvantaged for quite some time, still don't have anyone to play with. But when they find someone, then we are seeing that the political spectrum is going to explode. This is something that we have not seen in the US, perhaps because of the electoral system, but we have seen in Europe, in which what we have is this double tradition. Rural, declining towns normally have gone with right-wing populism, extreme right-wing populism. The disenfranchised in the cities, normally younger, normally slightly more educated or more educated than those that are going with extreme. They're going for left-wing and extreme left-wing populism. And that has created an explosion of the political scenario. Whether that's a good or a bad thing is for each of us to decide. But it has created a much more unstable situation that is putting at risk, in many ways, a system that, with all its faults, with all its problems, with all its disadvantages, and with all its need of reform, had generated the longest period of prosperity, equality, and, let's say, political and social stability that we have witnessed in our history.
So there are two questions now, one from Lily, one from Ian. But since Ian's is a follow-up question of the one of Ugo, can I just suggest that maybe Ian goes first, and then Lelio, you ask your question on the model specification. After that, we have time anyway. So Ian, if you want to ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good.
Hello, Ian.
My question follows up Ugo's, particularly in the sense of education. It seems to me that one of the strange silences in Andrés' presentation is about dramatic change that there's been in all our societies in the last 50 years in the role of graduates and the extent of higher education. And those of us who think that there is a very strong cultural dimension to populism everywhere are thinking about, I think, the persistence of reinforcement of a very old set of cultural values amongst a group who are conscious of becoming a minority, where the norm has become strictly very different from those anti-populist. And it seems to me some of the significance of the events of the last fortnight in relation to Black Lives is precisely this. So it's about a shock amongst particularly the educated part of the population that a set of cultural changes which they thought had been accomplished 50 years ago actually are not pervasive, and that there still needs to be reinforced. And so some of the shock and horror is around that. And I think it seems to me that the point about populism is in large part that it's actually a re-expression of a set of values which are very old and traditional in the places in which they're being espoused, which have faded amongst what's now just about a majority of the population which has higher education, something like that, and a sense of reaction against that. And specifically, Andrés was qualifying Putnam's social capital, even though I think all the time when you talk about social capital, you're really referring to what I would say is localist social capital, rather than the value of networks, including cosmopolitan networks, which are the ones which are most characteristic of us, most characteristic of those with higher education. And now part of the significance of that, I think, is that I think we need to be looking for interaction effects in places and not simply average effects. And the lesson for me of looking at the European Social Survey and sources of variation in the geography of that was not so much that you could find average compositional effects, but the different groups, particularly those with and without higher education, or those with different kinds of more occupationally focused human capital as well, responded in different opposite ways to shocks to the population composition. And I wondered whether you had thought about going further in doing the county analysis and actually looking for interaction effects of this sort between, for instance, the proportion of graduates in the population and the changes in the ethnic mix of the population, proportion of Muslims or other groups of that sort. Because it seems to me very clear when you look at the European Social Survey that there is almost no evidence of economic effects at a regional level and very little to an individual level, which gives me a lot of cause then about what shortcut explanations which focus upon that and upon the role that regional policy might play in reversing it. Sorry, I've rambled a bit, but I hope that the thrust is clear. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ian. I think that's there are a lot of issues there, and most of the issues are massively interesting, but they are, I think, beyond the scope of the paper. So the paper is really about social capital, economic decline, and interpersonal equality at the local level. Human capital, I use it mainly as a control variable, and ethnic mix is there. So there's an interesting new dimension there that would need to be controlled, and I would encourage you and others to take it. I don't think it's for this paper. However, I'm not going to dodge the question, and I'm going to try to answer on the question of human capital. This is what in my previous work I've been criticizing in terms of Europe, that most of the focus has been on individual characteristics of the population, including issues like personal wealth, education, ethnic origin, etc. And when it comes to do the analysis, in the case of Europe, we found that the only one that remained was human capital. But even if you control for human capital, the territorial dimension is strong, almost as strong, if not stronger, than human capital in that factor. And I do find that in the case of the US, the situation is very much that there are relatively few individual characteristics, albeit at aggregate level in county, that remain, and human capital is one of them. On the issue of what do we measure with social capital? And you're absolutely right. We do measure local social capital. This is what it's been measured in most cases. How do you measure cosmopolitan social capital? I mean, you have to go to surveys, and it's something that I can do. Where I would disagree is that education is associated to cosmopolitan social capital. People like you and me and most of the people in this group would have a significant cosmopolitan social capital. But most of the people I did my university with, they have just local social capital. So that's one of the things we have to think about, because in the end, probably local social capital is much more important than cosmopolitan social capital for the great majority of the population that feel completely excluded. And I hope that with the post-pandemic effect, we're not going to lose our cosmopolitan social capital. On the expression of a set of values that were already there and had faded or have faded as a result of education. It would be interesting to study that. Have they faded, or have they just been rehashed as a result of some people being more or less mobile? One of the things I'm finding is that a lot of local nationalism is very often driven by people with the highest level of education, but it's something that we need to be studied. But having said that, I think that what you're raising is a lot of other questions that are very interesting, but would make the paper far too long, far too multidimensional. And I think at this stage it's better for us to concentrate on what we're doing. And I would encourage you and others to try to pursue this idea of education and culture as a fundamental factor behind the rise of populism.
And thank you, Lelio, for waiting. Now, there's your question about the model specification.
Thank you, Alessandra. And of course, I would like to join our colleagues in thanking Andrés for his very interesting and inspiring presentation. Even the answers he is giving us are a source of important additional insights. My question is, I have a couple of related questions concerning details of your model specification. So much less interesting than the previous questions, probably. First of all, you include a measure of the level of within county interpersonal income inequality. Have you tried to experiment also with a measure of the change over time and within county inequality? And then on the other hand, have you tried to control also for the level of between county inequality? Of course, this is a variable which is available only at the country level, but it could be an interesting additional control. Or another way to address this issue could be to try to include a measure of the average income gap between each county and the national average. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Lelio. I think these are interesting questions. Whether we thought about doing change. Yes, we haven't done it because we haven't put it, because change we only have since 2000. We only have levels of inequality since 2000 until 2016, so we only have two observations. When we did the two observations, we found that it was insignificant. The coefficients were insignificant, so we decided not to put it. But I think it might not be a question of how unequal you are on the local level, but how much that inequality has changed. We find it doesn't work, or it doesn't give us any sort of significant coefficient. We took it out, but it's something that would be worth exploring more. On the between county inequality, here I think this is a very interesting question, because at the moment it might not be that you are the inequality within your city or within your town or within your county that is the one that matters, but it's how you perceive where you are relative to other people in the country, which is far more important. This is something that it would be worth pursuing. I mean, the problem is that, as you said, we can do it at the state level. And of course, if you do it for New York, we can have significant levels of inequality for 50 states, etc. Where if you do it for Delaware, where you have, I don't know how many counties, but 4 or 5, then it becomes problematic. One option that you highlighted is the average income gap relative from the county to the rest of the country, which will give us an indicator for the whole of the US. But having said that, I do find that here is where this is the important dimension, the territorial dimension, because then we are including a dimension which is no longer interpersonal, is interterritorial, and saying that people living in a particular place are less well off than people, the average of people. And this is something I didn't answer to Ian, and Ian is absolutely right that I'm just focusing on averages. We might want to look at also specific deviations and specific cases, etc. But in this case, we'll be looking at an average deviation relative, which would be another measure of territorial inequality that we're already measuring. I think it's important to do that, and it would probably highlight new changes, because one of the things I find in all this literature is that even though, whereas Robert Putnam completely ignores the role of place and the role of rising territorial inequality, absolutely, it's completely neglected. I mean, there's a lot of other declines, but not territorial decline. Kathy Kramer, for example, highlights the whole dimension of the importance of place. But when it comes to talking about the rise of inequality, it just talks about interpersonal inequality. But the role of inequality that she's talking about without knowing is mainly the rise in territorial inequality between more prosperous cities and declining communities.
Thank you, Andres. I just have a few final thoughts, and then I promise we'll let you go rest, since you haven't slept, and I feel guilty now about that, very guilty, because
you shouldn't feel guilty. It's my problem. I should have delivered it better.
No, but you're always so nice, and I know you're very busy, and yet you agreed on giving this seminar, so I'm very thankful for that. So this is what I was thinking throughout the presentation and also throughout the discussion. First of all, you always have very clever ideas, and the clarity of your presentation is amazing, and you are well known for that. So, it's really great. But what I also like of your presentation today, but also all the presentations I've seen through the years, and I've seen a lot of them, as you know, it's the kind of wow factors. It's not just the title. I'm talking about the results. There's always something that makes you think, right? Oh, why is that? Or that is not what you normally expect. And this is what I like, because it makes me kind of challenge my beliefs. So that's what I really like. So thinking about your results, it doesn't really bother me, your results on social capital. In fact, I thought, smart, because somehow, having lived in the US, I don't know, but it kind of makes sense to me, so it really doesn't bother me that much. However, what really surprised me was your results on inequality. And, you're talking about territorial inequality, interpersonal inequality, but I've been working on this paper with Daria Denti, that was at the LSE a few months, and she also worked with Simona. And we actually found that in our model that inequality was the factor motivating the intensity of online tweets of hatred, so hate tweets. So we connected inequality as the main determinants in motivating the hate in the Italian context, of course. And we had all sorts of variables inside the model as well, including unemployment, poverty, and they were not that significant. So, and of course, I'm wondering why, and I'm thinking, okay, we had levels, not changes. Although, of course, we instrumented, we had instrumental variable to take into account endogeneity, especially because we were looking at levels. So is it because we were looking at levels, you were looking at changes? Does it make any difference that maybe in certain areas you already had a very high level of inequality, so when you look at changes, maybe that didn't change very much? I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud. Of course, we also have different territorial contexts, so, two different things. We are probably comparing apples and oranges, but we actually found a very strong link in fact, causality, if we believe that the instrument was strong enough, between the hatred and inequality. And then, just out of curiosity, I would like to see what your state fixed effect, the significance one, positive and negative, if there was some kind of, clustering in macro areas or something. But this is just because I like more, I'm an economist, and yet I like maps more than geographers. So I always wonder about the maps of the fixed effect. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Alessandra. I'm going to start with the last one, which is the easy one. I put a state fixed effects, and when this data comes out, I really don't look at them anymore. So I don't know. I don't know whether it's a cluster. I just need to check. And increasingly, when I do the do files now, I don't even see the state fixed effects, but they are there. So
I was just wondering about maybe the south versus the northern.
It would be interesting to check, absolutely, but I overlooked that completely. Second, on the hatreds and the interpersonal inequality factor. Here, I'm going to link to the questions that came from Ugo before and from Ian about this idea that these are minorities that have been conscious of being minorities for a long time. I think the reaction on the organization normally doesn't come from people that have been disadvantaged for a long time or have been neglected for a very, very long time. It's not the south of Italy that has rebelled. And the south of Italy has been disadvantaged for centuries now, 2, 3, 4 centuries. So I'm thinking about Naples as being, is the ones that are losing out. This is like a Greek tragedy or a Shakespearean tragedy. The biggest revenges take place not by those that are at the bottom of the scale, that have always been disadvantaged, but those that have something and have lost it and still think they can come back, or there's a way back. And this is why I think the drivers of the change at the moment are not the least developed regions of Europe, or they're not necessarily the least developed areas of the US and the most disadvantaged, or they are not even, although, as we were saying, this can change. They're not even the groups that have been the most disadvantaged, the blacks until now, or the Hispanic. They are the middle-class whites that were wealthy, that had a future for their children, their grandchildren, that thought they had made it. And now they've seen, like the North Italians of the former industrial districts in Cremona, in Pavia, in Biella, in all these places, that decided we're still rich, but 30 years ago we were far richer than we are, and we have lost out relative to everyone. These are the ones that have got organized and found someone to play golf with or play football with. That doesn't mean that the other groups that have been disadvantaged for long cannot organize themselves and create a reaction that is going, perhaps, in the case of the US, lead to an explosion, as we have seen in the case of Europe, in many parts of Europe, of the political panorama in the near future.
Thank you very much. We have no questions, and I think we can just thank Andrés again. You are our last seminar for this series, so this expression, this Latin expression, dulcis in fundo. The sweet thing is at the end. So you conclude our seminar series for now. However, I don't know if Sandro wants to say something about that. We are continuing with the series, even if not with the same frequency, especially through the autumn. Sandro, do you want to say something about that?
No, just to say that is the decision that we have taken because of the great success that we had with this webinar series. It was unexpectedly successful. We had the high average of participants in each and every seminar. So we thought, why not carry out? And of course, we're going to do it less frequently. I'm not going to have one webinar per week because it's really tiring in terms of organization, but we decided to carry on. That's it.
So check our website, Twitter, and whatever for news. But again, let me thank Andrés again for this great seminar today. And of course, I want to thank all the participants because you have really been with us throughout this month and a half, and we are really very grateful. So thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you very much to everyone, and I hope that the next seminar would be a combination of virtual but also in L'Aquila. So that would mean that we are all in a much better situation than we are at the moment.
And we can offer you a dinner tonight, right? And food is good in L'Aquila. You should mention
Absolutely,
that.
yes. It's a great place to go to.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much from my side too. Thank you very much. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye, and thank you all very much. Well done, Andres.
Thank you.